The sea on a winter's night has a way of muting the world. Above the surface, a pale half-moon hung in the sky, laying a thin ribbon of silver across the Pacific swells. Each crest rose and fell with timeless rhythm, indifferent to the war raging across continents. The only sound was the wind, whispering over the water. To a sailor standing watch on the deck of a Japanese destroyer, it might have seemed peaceful, deceptively so. Beneath that shimmering skin of ocean, a predator waited. USS Archerfish, a Below-class submarine of the United States Navy, stretched 311 feet of welded steel, her gray hull nearly invisible against the sea. On the surface, her conning tower was just a shadow. Submerged, only her periscope and radar antenna betrayed her presence. Inside the pressure hull, the air was close and heavy, thick with oil, sweat, and machinery. Men moved in silence among valves, gauges, and plotting tables, their voices hushed, their focus absolute. They had been at war for years, but tonight felt different. Something monumental was unfolding. At the center stood Commander Joseph Enright, 33 years old, dark-eyed, and carrying the burden of a reputation not yet redeemed. On a previous command, he had hesitated at a crucial moment and returned from patrol without firing a single torpedo. For a submariner, that was worse than failure. It was shame. Enright had even asked to be relieved, doubting his own instincts. He carried that scar into every decision now. Tonight, in these black waters south of Honshu, he meant to prove himself. He stood at the periscope, one hand on the grip, the other fingering a rosary in his pocket. Catholic by upbringing, though not overtly devout, he drew comfort from the beads when responsibility pressed hard on him. And tonight, responsibility pressed heavily. Somewhere to the north, beyond the headlands of Tokyo Bay, radar had picked up a massive contact, steady, safe west, 12 miles away. The blip was too large to be a freighter. Enright knew in his bones this was something far greater. The question pressing through every mind was simple. What was it? Earlier that evening, Archerfish had been assigned to lifeguard duty, waiting to rescue down American airmen from raids that never came. Freed from that station, she now stalked a new contact, a prize, though no one yet knew just how extraordinary. Commander Enright's thoughts drifted to Japan's floating giants, the great battleships Yamato and Musashi, behemoths whose very presence had shaken the seas. Musashi had gone down at Letta Gulf only weeks earlier, beaten into the depths by relentless American bombers. Could Yamato herself now be stirring? Or was there something stranger still? Something new? The submarine shuddered as she came about, her steel body answering the helm. In the control room, men hunched over the plotting board, tracing lines of relative motion, marking bearings with grease pencils. Every adjustment mattered. Geometry and timing meant life or death. A miscalculation could cost them the target, or invite a counterattack from the destroyers that surely screened it. For now, Archerfish held her distance, shadowing on the surface. Darkness and a thin veil of cloud concealed her silhouette, a shadow stalking shadows. Inside, tension coiled tight, but discipline held. The crew had long ago adapted to cramped quarters and the claustrophobic air of submarine life. Tonight, that discipline would be tested to its limit. Torpedo men slept alongside their weapons in the forward room. Officers shared bunks in shifts, and every man knew his station by instinct. The air carried its constant undertone, fans and pumps, the low rumble of the diesels when surfaced. Sweat-soaked khakis clung to the crew, many stripped to undershirts in the muggy compartments. On nights like this, nerves sharpened every sound. The groan of the hull under pressure, the slap of waves against the bow, the faint buzz of the radar screen. Each noise was magnified by expectation, and Enright was determined not to let expectation become hesitation again. Months earlier, at a poker table in Midway, a senior officer had studied his bluffing and asked, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" Enright's answer had been simple, yes. That answer had earned him a second chance. Now, at the periscope, that chance was about to be tested. What he could not yet know was the scale of the prize before him. The ship he stalked was Shinano, the pride of Japan shipyards. At 71,890 tons fully loaded, she was the largest aircraft carrier the world had ever seen. Completed in secrecy, commissioned only days earlier, she sailed with a skeleton crew, incomplete systems, and little training. Meant as a symbol of strength and defiance, she was instead steaming into the path of a single submarine commanded by a man desperate for redemption. The moon slipped behind a veil of cloud, darkening the horizon. The sea seemed to hold its breath. Enright bent to the eyepiece again. The silhouette loomed faint but undeniable, flanked by escorts, dark smudges cutting through the water. A destroyer suddenly turned, racing toward them. For a heartbeat, the hunter seemed about to become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, it wheeled back and resumed station. The chance remained. Calm but firm, Enright whispered to his officers, "Stay with her. Let her zig. We'll find where she straightens out." His words carried more than orders. They were a promise, to himself, to his men, to his career. He would not hesitate. Not this time. He would strike. The clock edged toward midnight. Ahead, the largest warship in history moved through the darkness, unaware that beneath the calm sea a submarine had fixed her in its sights. The stage was set. The game of patience, geometry, and fate had begun. It was 1944, and the tide of the Second World War had shifted beyond reversal. For Japan, an empire that had once stretched from the frozen Aleutians to the steaming jungles of Burma, the war was no longer about conquest. It was about survival. The Pacific was no longer a protective moat around the Japanese home islands. It had become a shrinking battlefield, closing in month by month. American forces leapt from island to island in a relentless advance. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Each conquest brought U.S. troops closer to Japan's heart. With every step, the Japanese military fought from weaker ground, stretched thinner, with dwindling resources and sinking morale. By the summer of 1944, the Philippines campaign was underway. General Douglas MacArthur, true to his famous promise, had returned. His troops battled their way through Leyte and beyond, while Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the vast armadas of the Pacific Fleet in a steady drive toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had turned hostile to Japanese shipping. Once dominated by the Imperial Navy, they now belonged to American submarines. The Silent Service waged a campaign of strangulation, cutting Japan's merchant fleet to pieces. Tankers carrying oil from the East Indies went down faster than they could be replaced. Cargo ships carrying food, weapons, and raw materials became easy prey for patient submarines armed with torpedoes and precision. By late 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the shortage was crippling. Factories slowed, fuel dwindled, and even basic supplies grew scarce. The arithmetic of war was unforgiving. Where once the empire could replace ships and aircraft, now every loss was irreplaceable. The great shipyards that had launched the Pearl Harbor strike were reduced to patching hulks. Steel was scarce. Skilled workers had been conscripted. And high above, American bombers were beginning to rain destruction on the industrial heartland. At sea, the situation was equally dire. The U.S. Navy had assembled the most powerful carrier strike forces ever seen. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets roamed at will, their aircraft smashing Japanese bases and striking the home islands themselves. The skies were no longer safe. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its immense range, had begun daylight raids against Japanese cities. Tokyo and Nagoya burned in firestorms, and worse was to come. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern and feared in the Pacific, was now a shadow of itself. Its carrier arm had been shattered at Midway in 1942. Its battleships had bled in the Solomons and the Marianas. And at the Great Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan had gambled everything in one desperate throw. The result was catastrophe. Proud carriers like Zui Kaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, went down in flames. Do you want me to carry this forward into the aftermath of Leyte Gulf, showing how that disaster left Japan clinging to superweapons like Shinano as a last hope? New steel plates were welded over the scars. Bent fittings were hammered straight or replaced. Fresh paint concealed the damage. Within 3 weeks, the visible evidence of disaster had vanished, but those who had witnessed it could not forget. They remembered the massive hull slamming against the dock walls, the screams of crushed workers, the chaos that felt like a curse taking shape. Work resumed at an even more frantic pace. The November deadline loomed, and the accident had cost precious time. Safety procedures, already compromised, were cut further. Watertight doors that should have been pressure tested were only checked to see if they closed. Electrical systems were given cursory inspections. The guiding assumption seemed to be, if Shinano looked complete, then she was complete. Her crew reflected the same haste. Normally, a carrier's company trained for months before deployment, drilling until every man knew his station and could step into another's if needed. Damage control, arguably the most critical skill aboard, demanded perfect coordination, sealing flooded compartments, manning pumps, fighting fires, often in darkness and under duress. But Shinano's crew had been thrown together from wherever men could be found. Veterans from sunken ships, raw recruits barely out of training, even conscripted civilians, all jammed aboard with minimal organization. Many did not even share the same dialect. Drills quickly exposed a weakness. Men got lost in the maze of passageways. Equipment was misplaced. Orders were misunderstood. Confusion reigned. Among the crew, whispers of the curse refused to die. Petty officers reported men requesting transfers, feigning illness, even injuring themselves to avoid setting sail on Shinano at 6 p.m. The mooring lines were cast off. Tugboats strained against their hawsers, pulling the massive carrier clear of the pier. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Shinano began to move under her own power. Her 4 screws churned the dark water, sending long ripples through the harbor. Men lining the decks felt a shiver of pride despite their unease. For all her flaws, she was magnificent, a fortress of steel unlike anything else afloat. The destroyers fell into position, isokays ahead, yukikaze and hamakays to port and starboard. Their silhouettes cut lean, predatory shapes against the dusk, dwarfed by the colossal bulk they were sworn to protect. As Shinano passed through the submarine net to the harbor entrance, a hush seemed to fall across her crew. Searchlights swept the water, cutting pale beams across the black surface. Then one lookout spotted it, a pale form drifting just outside the nets. A dead albatross, wings spread wide, rocked gently on the tide. Some sailors muttered, others fell silent. An ill omen, they whispered. A cursed ship, now cursed again. Captain Abe gave no sign he noticed. From the bridge, he ordered the engines ahead. The carrier pushed into the open sea, her escorts closing in around her. The coast slid past the starboard, lights winking from distant villages. Overhead, the sky deepened to black. The world's largest warship was at sea for the first time. Tugs eased her massive bulk from the pier, and slowly her screws began to turn. At first she moved with hesitation, then with gathering strength, the great ship advancing under her own power for the very first time. For all the rushed construction, the cursed launch, and the unfinished systems, she was still magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck towered 60 feet above the waterline. She displaced more than most harbors could contain. By any measure, she was an engineering marvel. The 3 destroyers formed their escort screen, isokays in the lead, yukikaze and hamakays guarding the flanks. Together, the 4 ships pressed toward the harbor mouth and the open sea beyond. As they slipped through protective submarine nets, several sailors pointed out a grim sight. The body of an albatross drifting on the tide, wings spread wide, white against the black water, like a banner of surrender. What no one aboard Shinano knew was that 30 miles to the south, USS Archerfish was just beginning her patrol. The submarine had been assigned lifeguard duty, waiting to rescue down American airmen from a bombing raid that never launched. With that mission canceled due to weather, she was now free to hunt. Commander Enright had surfaced to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for submarines, dark enough to cloak their low silhouette, calm enough for sharp sound conditions, with just enough moonlight to reveal silhouettes on the horizon. At 8:48 p.m., the radar operator broke the silence. Contact. Bearing 020, range 12 miles. The radar screen showed a large, steady blip, moving southwest at roughly 20 knots. Enright rushed to the bridge and raised his binoculars. On the horizon, just visible, loomed a dark mass flanked by smaller shapes, escorts. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant ship. The size, the speed, the company, it could only be a capital warship. Battle stations, Enright ordered quietly. Inside Archerfish, the crew moved with practiced calm. Men slid into their posts, every sound muted, every motion precise. The hunt had begun. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their weapons with practiced hands. In the control room, plotting teams bent over charts and calculating boards. The hunt was on. Enright faced an immediate problem. The target was making 20 knots, faster than Archerfish maximum surface speed of 19. On paper, the chase was hopeless. But Enright knew Japanese ships rarely steamed straight. They zigzagged to foil submarine attacks, and every change of course bled away speed. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut the corners, he might yet close the distance. For the next hour, Archerfish ran at full power, her 4 diesel straining. The submarine shuddered with the effort, her hull cleaving through black swells, spray bursting over the bow. Below, the engine room became a furnace. Temperatures soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit as men coaxed every last revolution from the engines. Crewmen staggered topside in shifts, gasping fresh air before diving back into stifling heat. Aboard Shinano, the hunters were already the hunted. On her bridge, radar operators picked up the submarine almost immediately. Though incomplete, the equipment still worked well enough to register a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe listened to the report without surprise. Submarines haunted these waters. He had expected them. Signal the escorts, he ordered evenly. Enemy submarine, bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Yet Abe knew his situation was precarious. For all her size, Shinano was vulnerable. She carried no aircraft to scout, and her own sonar was not yet operational. Protection rested entirely with her destroyers, and even they were compromised. Their sonar sets, damaged in earlier battles and hastily repaired with inferior parts, could not be trusted. The destroyers were ill-prepared for a prolonged hunt. Their depth charge racks were only half-filled. Munitions were short everywhere. Abe also faced a cruel dilemma. If he ordered the escorts to chase the contact, they would have to leave Shinano's side, exposing her to the possibility of other submarines lying in wait. American wolf packs often used such tactics, one boat revealing itself to draw up protection while others closed in for the kill. Yet if he kept the destroyers close, the trailing submarine could simply shadow them, broadcasting Shinano's position to other boats or even guiding bombers in. After a moment's thought, Abe chose what seemed the safer course. He would keep his escorts tight and rely on speed and maneuver to shake the pursuit. Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm swung over, and Shinano's massive hull began a ponderous dance. 45 degrees to port steady for 10 minutes, then 60 degrees to starboard for 8, back to base course for 15, and repeat. It was a textbook anti-submarine tactic, but one with serious drawbacks. Each turn cost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now stretch longer. Fuel consumption rose, and most critically, the pattern could be read and exploited by a skilled submarine commander, which was exactly what Enright was doing. In Archerfish control room, the plotting team tracked every shift in Shinano's heading. Lieutenant Commander Robert Bobjinski, the executive officer, bent over the chart, marking angles and times with quick precision. "She's following a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, we'll gain on her." It became a duel of geometry. Each time Shinano swung wide, the submarine sliced across the arc, closing the gap. The carrier's straight-line speed was untouchable, but her evasive maneuvers turned into opportunities. The chase demanded exact calculation and steady nerves. One error, and contact would be lost. One slip in stealth, and the destroyers would smother them in depth charges. As the hours dragged on, Shinano's unfinished state began to betray her. At 11 p.m., engineers reported trouble with the starboard inboard propeller shaft. The bearing was overheating. Friction at high revolutions drove temperatures into the danger zone. The engineering officer faced a grim choice: push on and risk mechanical failure, or ease the shaft and sacrifice speed. High-speed screws approaching, destroyer bearing 340, closing fast. Enright had seconds to choose: crash dive and probably lose his target forever, or hold depth and risk detection. He ordered Archerfish down, but only to 150 feet, shallow enough to resurface quickly. Rig for silent running. Rig for depth charge evasion, he added. The destroyer thundered overhead. Her screws beat the water. Men aboard Archerfish held their breath for the concussion of depth charges. None came. ISOKs had lost contact and, worse, had broken Captain Ubez's order to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shinano's bridge called her back to station. The moment ISOKs turned, Enright eased Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shinano was still there, still on course, still enormous, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had hunted all night was at hand. At 3:15 everything lined up. Shinano steadied on a base heading of 210 degrees toward Cure, making 16 knots and lying broadside to the submarine. Range, 1,400 yards. Speed and angle were ideal. Close enough for accuracy, broadside for maximum target area, slow enough for a sound firing solution. Enright raised the periscope. The carrier filled the lens, massive, hulking, a city of steel. He felt that old, absolute hush, the quiet before a strike. Her flight deck rose like a sheer cliff. The island loomed like a skyscraper. Light spilled from portholes. Escorts made dark shadows at her flanks, and white water boiled at her bow. Enright sketched quickly, recording that strange, rounded bow that no recognition manual showed, and gave the order, final bearing and shoot. Make ready all tubes. In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14s waited. Troubles that had plagued the early war models, faulty exploders and depth errors, were, by now, cured. These were reliable killers, each carrying roughly 600 pounds of torpex. Set depth 10 feet, Enright commanded. Shallow and brutal, a hit high on the hull would wreck stability as much as flood compartments. The fire control party fed speed, angle, and range into the torpedo data computer. The analog gears and cams spat out a firing solution. It was checked and checked again. There would be no second chance. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as compressed air expelled the first weapon. The torpedo broke the surface with a muted spit, its propellers biting the dark and driving it toward the carrier at about 4 to 6 knots. Fire 2. 8 seconds between shots let each weapon clear the tube and the sub's wake. Fire 3. Fire 4. Fire 5. Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 iron wheels were streaking through black water toward Shinano, hot, straight, and true, every one of them a single sentence. The ocean closed over them. The hunt became a line of thunder beneath the waves. Their wakes, faint but unmistakable in the moonlight, drew straight lines toward the carrier's flank. On Shinano's bridge, Lookout shouted the alarm too late. Torpedo starboard. Captain Abe snapped for full rudder, but the ship's immense mass answered sluggishly. She had barely begun to heal when the first torpedo slammed home. The blast was colossal. A geyser of water rose higher than the flight deck, and the carrier lurched to port. Then came the second, the third, the fourth, 4 detonations in less than half a minute, all along the starboard side between the bow and the island. The first struck near frame 104, beside an aviation fuel tank, empty, by luck. The explosion ripped a hole 20 feet wide, flooding compartments instantly. The second smashed into frame 142, obliterating the starboard outboard engine room. Men inside never had a chance. Seawater and superheated steam engulfed them in seconds. The third tore open frame 166, drowning fire room number 3. The fourth struck frame 190, rupturing a fuel tank and spreading oil through companionways. On the bridge, officers reeled at the violence. Yet Shinano was so massive that the torpedoes seemed to stagger her rather than break her. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could endure it. She had been built on a battleship's bones, armored to withstand such punishment. But below decks, the truth was far grimmer. Her unfinished state now turned deadly. Watertight doors that had never been pressure-tested failed almost at once, some sealing men inside to drown, others refusing to close at all. Welds split open under stress. Electrical panels, doused with seawater, blew out in showers of sparks. The blows that should have been survivable were becoming mortal wounds. Damage control teams fought back with dogged energy, but they were outmatched by confusion and inexperience. Men who'd never drilled together scrambled from station to station. Orders came fast and conflicting. Some parties rushed to counterflood portside compartments to correct the list, while others fought to pump water out of the same spaces. The two efforts fought each other. Below, the engine rooms became a tomb. Sea surged through the starboard spaces. Engineers waded in rising water, trying to keep pumps alive. When seawater reached electrical panels, the result was blinding sparks and exploding conduit, forcing crews back. One by one, the starboard engines quit. The list crept higher, 5 degrees, then 10, then 13. On the flight deck, the emergency was immediate and visible. Aircraft, vehicles, and loose gear began to slide. Sailors formed human chains trying to snare falling crates, but a fuel truck broke loose and smashed into the island. Boxes of ammunition tumbled into the sea. Chaos moved from the lower decks to the top of the ship. Captain Abe stayed rigid on the bridge, issuing orders with a voice that did not betray panic. He ordered counter-flooding to trim the list and pointed the ship for the nearest shore, hoping to beach her and save what he could. He sent a message to Naval Headquarters, Shinano torpedoed, position 32 degrees 0 minutes north, 137 degrees 0 minutes east, attempting to reach shore. Yet even as he spoke, he must have felt the truth in his bones. Reports from below were uniformly grim. Flooding uncontrolled, pumps overwhelmed, crews unfamiliar with their damaged stations. The ship that had left Yokosuka as a monument was dying. Beneath the waves, Archerfish was now in her most perilous posture. Enright had taken the sub-deep after firing. Standard practice to avoid a swift counterattack, but the immediate danger had only begun. Above them, Japanese destroyers screamed back and forth, sonar pinging, crews readying depth charges. 400 feet, Enright ordered, rig for silent running. Archerfish slid into the darker water. Voices went to whispers. Men moved with the practiced hush of veterans. Breaths were shallow, every sound swallowed by the pressure of the ocean. Outside, the throbbing of distant screws and the intermittent sonar blips marked the lethal ballet above. The submarine held its breath and waited. The destroyers closed in above them. From inside Archerfish, the crew heard the rising whine of screws, the sharp pings of active sonar, and then the splash of depth charges hitting water. A moment later, the sea convulsed. 5 detonations thundered in sequence, the submarine shuddering under the pressure. Light bulbs burst, and cork insulation rained from the overhead. Yet the blasts were distant, at least 500 yards. The Japanese sonar was working, but poorly, damaged and patched with inferior components. It lacked the precision needed to lock on. Cripple the boat. After an hour, the fury faded. The screws receded, the sonar pings weakened, and finally the ocean grew quiet. The destroyers had abandoned the chase, hurrying back to their stricken charge. At dawn, Enright eased Archerfish back to periscope depth. The horizon was clear. No escorts, no carrier. Whatever fate had overtaken the giant ship, she was gone from sight. That same dawn, November 29th, Shinano was in her death throes. The list had reached 20 degrees. Walking her decks was nearly impossible. Men pulled themselves along with ropes, clinging to rails that had become climbing holds. In the cavernous hangar, ochre-painted suicide planes had broken free, colliding in slow motion as the ship tilted. Their volatile rocket fuel turned the space into a floating powder keg. Below, flooding had spread far beyond the torpedo wounds. This was what naval architects call progressive flooding, water creeping through doors, vents, cable runs, every weakness in the ship's unfinished hull. It spread like a cancer. Compartments thought secure filled one after another. Thousands of tons of seawater dragged Shinano lower, her stability ebbing away. Captain Abe made one last attempt to save her. He ordered all engines ahead full, hoping to drive for shore. But with only the port engines left, the great ship could barely manage 10 knots. Her rudder couldn't balance the uneven thrust, and instead of closing on land, she turned in wide, helpless circles. At 8:30, Abe gave the signal, prepare to abandon ship. It was not yet the final order, but every man understood. Wounded sailors were carried up from the lower decks. Life jackets were passed out. The destroyers closed in, ready to pluck survivors from the sea. Below decks, courage and despair mingled. Engineers stayed at their posts until the water forced them out, keeping power to the pumps and lights alive a little longer. Surgeons struggled to move patients from tilting sick bays. In one compartment, 30 men were trapped behind a warped hatch. Their pounding echoed through the steel for an hour, then fell silent. The end came swiftly. At 10:18, the list lurched to 35 degrees. Men, planes, and equipment slid down the slanted flight deck into the sea. The final order rang out, abandon ship, but many were already beyond saving. Compartments flooded too fast, hatches jammed, ladders overturned. Some sailors leapt from the 60-foot flight deck. Many died on impact. On the bridge, Captain Abe stood firm. Tradition bound him to his ship. As chaos consumed the decks below, he chose to remain, watching over the vessel he had been entrusted with, until the sea claimed them both. He would go down with his ship. Captain Abe bound himself to the helm, determined to face the end with dignity. Around him, his senior officers chose the same fate. As the sea closed in, they lifted their voices in the national anthem. At 10:55, Shinano rolled onto her side. Her flight deck passed vertical, then the giant carrier capsized completely. For a fleeting moment, her vast underbelly, barnacles and red interfouling paint glistening in the sun, was laid bare to the sky. Then came the thunder of trapped air bursting free as she plunged beneath the waves. The largest warship ever built had lasted only 17 hours at sea. The surface was left a scene of chaos, wreckage scattered across the swells, and men, thousands of them, fighting for life in oil-slicked water. More than 2,000 had been aboard. Now only hundreds remained, clinging to debris or calling out for rescue. The 3 destroyers wove among them, lowering nets and ropes. But the rescues were not indiscriminate. Tradition demanded that officers be saved first. Hardened captains, worn by years of war, gave brutal orders, save only the brave. Panic was seen as weakness. Men who cried out in terror were passed by. Some survivors, coated in thick black oil, slipped from grasping hands back into the sea. Others, numbed by the cold winter water, lost strength and drifted under. For many, survival had been within sight, yet slipped away before rescue could reach them. When the rescue ended, 1,080 men had been pulled from the sea. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and nearly all his senior officers, were gone. It was one of the greatest single-ship losses of life in the Pacific War. For Japan, the blow was catastrophic, but it had to be concealed. Shinano had been a state secret, and her loss would remain one. Survivors were sworn to silence. Families of the dead were told only that their loved ones had fallen in action, with no hint of where or how. Official records were sealed. To the Japanese public, Shinano had never existed. But in war, secrets rarely last. American code breakers, sifting through intercepted messages, learned of the sinking within days. The name Shinano surfaced in decoded traffic, along with the coordinates of her loss. Yet U.S. intelligence was baffled. No such ship was listed in their records. What, then, had Archerfish destroyed? When Commander Enright submitted his patrol report in December, claiming the sinking of a carrier of extraordinary size, skepticism greeted him. Naval intelligence would credit him with no more than a 28,000-ton carrier. Impressive, but nowhere near what he had described. Only after Japan's surrender, when American investigators accessed Imperial Navy records, did the truth emerge. Shinano had displaced 71,890 tons fully loaded. She was not only the largest aircraft carrier of the war, she was the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. Enright's instincts had been right all along. His redemption was complete. The story of Shinano's single voyage carries lessons that reach far beyond the night of November 1944. It is a parable of hubris and humility, of grand ambition undone by neglected fundamentals, of how the smallest hunter can bring down the mightiest prey when circumstances align. For Japan, Shinano symbolized the collapse of the decisive weapon philosophy. Again and again, Japanese strategy sought salvation in singular wonders, super battleships, divine winds, miraculous carriers. Yet wars are not won by symbols but by systems. While Japan built one massive carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan rushed incomplete ships into service, America trained its crews relentlessly and maintained discipline in construction. The outcome was inevitable. The technical lessons were just as stark. Size without reliability is weakness. Armor without damage control is illusion. A warship's true strength lies not only in her steel, but in the skill of her crew, the soundness of her workmanship, and the integrity of every weld and seal. Shinano did not fail because the design was unsound. She failed because she was incomplete. For the submarine force, her destruction was vindication. Small, inexpensive boats crewed by fewer than 100 men could annihilate capital ships costing thousands of times more. In that contrast, the future of naval warfare was foreshadowed. He ordered the reduction. Shinano's pace dropped from 20 knots to 18. On paper, the loss seemed minor. In reality, It was decisive. Aboard Archerfish, the sonar operator caught the change immediately. "She's slowing," he said, voice low but urgent. On the bridge, Enright's lips tightened into a smile. The hunt was shifting in his favor. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in Enright's favor. But aboard Shinano, trouble was multiplying. Time it just right, he'd have his firing solution. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The sub slid beneath the waves, leaving only her slender antenna above water. F dropped, but so did her profile. Now she was a shadow, watching, patient, invisible. On Shinano's bridge, tension thickened with every report. The submarine was still out there, dogging them. Why hadn't it struck? Why hadn't the escorts driven it off? Some officers whispered it was summoning others, that they were being herded into a kill zone. Abe dismissed the talk as rumor, but in his heart, he wondered. The Americans had changed. They hunted in packs now, coordinated, relentless. At 2:56 a.m., fate forced the issue. Isokay's, the lead destroyer, reported a periscope sighting off the starboard bow. Her captain didn't wait for orders. With a roar of engines, the destroyer surged ahead, bow wave foaming white as she pushed to 35 knots. Deep below, Archerfish sonar operator stiffened. "Destroyer charging, fast bearing change," he shouted. The control room fell into taut silence. Modern naval strategists study Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an age of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the temptation remains to believe in the decisive weapon, the single platform that will guarantee victory. But Shinano's fate reminds us that no warship, however massive, is invulnerable. Strength lies not in size alone, but in training, preparation, and the resilience of the systems that support the fight. Her brief voyage endures as a stark lesson. In war, the margin between triumph and catastrophe may be measured not in tons of steel, but in the smallest failure left uncorrected. The crew of Archerfish held reunion for decades, their bond sealed by that single night when they brought down the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. For them, it was the pinnacle of their service, a reminder of what skill, persistence, and fortune could achieve against impossible odds. For Japan, Shinano remained a ghost, concealed in secrecy during the war, rediscovered in shame after it. She symbolized not power, but the futility of desperate ambition. For history, her story endures as both legend and warning. The world's greatest carrier lasted just 17 hours at sea, undone not by overwhelming fleets or massive air raids, but by one submarine, one commander's resolve, and 6 torpedoes that ran true. They gathered as old men, once young sailors, to remember their moment of glory. At reunions, they told stories of the long chase, the tension before the attack, the thunder of torpedoes striking home. But their memories were not only a triumph. They spoke, too, of Shinano's crew, men who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time revealed them as simply fellow sailors who had endured the same sea. When secrecy finally lifted, some survivors of Shinano also shared their accounts. They recalled the chaos, the fear, the terrible sight of their great ship rolling over and sinking. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing rigid at his post as the water closed around him. They remembered comrades who forced open hatches, who gave up life jackets, who pushed others to safety before being swallowed by the sea. In Japan, Shinano came to symbolize the war's final phase, grand gestures that achieved nothing, magnificent failures that only deepened the nation's suffering. She embodied the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than facing defeat. For America, her sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands on a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome armor and size. It was David and Goliath written in steel and torpedoes, proof that in war, the smallest unit could still achieve strategic victory. When deep-sea explorers finally discovered Shinano's wreck in 2019, they found the ship astonishingly intact despite 75 years on the seabed. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted the crushing pressure of the deep. Yet she lies inverted, her proud flight deck buried in silt, a monument not to strength fulfilled, but to ambition that outran capability. Today, as nations once more compete to build ever larger and more powerful warships, Shinano's story remains a warning. Technology evolves, yet the human failings that doomed her endure. Ships are still rushed to sea before they are ready. Crews still sail with inadequate training. Leaders still place blind faith in the idea that one supreme weapon can alter the course of war. The ghost of Shinano cautions against such hubris. Her final lesson is universal. In war, as in life, victory does not always belong to the swiftest or the strongest. Sometimes patience overcomes power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. And sometimes a single night encounter can echo through history, teaching generations about courage, folly, and the razor-thin line between triumph and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships crossed paths in the Pacific darkness, one the largest carrier ever built, the other an unremarkable submarine. When dawn came, only one remained. Such is the nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean cares nothing for size or strength. It swallows all alike, keeping its secrets in the silent depths where Shinano rests still, the greatest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant brought down by a foe she never truly saw.